Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Gangs of the El Paso-Juárez Borderland, A History, by Mike Tapia. Narrated by Timothy Andrés Pabon. Publisher's note: in this audio edition you will hear references to illustrations, figures, maps, and tables present in the print and e-book formats of this book. Introduction. The El Paso-Juárez Borderland as place and its criminal subcultures. Place can sometimes be difficult to define. El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, share a physical, historical, cultural, familial, and to some extent economic space. Yet in many respects, the first meets third world contrast between them is striking. In other instances, it is difficult to distinguish between the two places. A sister cities metaphor is often used by local cultural and business elites to describe them, but it competes with a powerful, totally different places narrative among the general population. Juárez and El Paso, and residually its entire region, are wrought with contradictions that are often difficult to analyze and make sense of. The implications this has for criminal and delinquent subculture formation is one such area. This work is focused on the region encompassing West Texas, southern New Mexico, and northern Chihuahua, Mexico. It is a case study examining the past 100 years of historical developments there through a criminological lens. The area contains some 3 million people anchored by the binational metroplex of El Paso-Juárez. The easternmost point of this borderland region is the Fort Hancock port of entry, about 50 miles east of El Paso-Juárez. En route are a series of small agricultural border towns straddling the border that include Socorro, San Elizario, Clint, Fabens, Tornillo, and Acala. On the Mexican side of this lower valley area are the Badlands, the notorious eastern Valle de Juárez, known during the recent guerra, i.e., drug gang war, as a stronghold of the Sinaloa cartel, U.S. Department of Justice, 2011. Across the border at Fort Hancock is El Porvenir, a town of about 3,000 people, serving as the rural portion of Praxedis Guerrero. Both places had a mass population exodus in 2010 due to chronic drug war violence, leaving a total estimated range of between 5,000 and 7,000 people there today. The westernmost part of this borderland region is Columbus, New Mexico. It is an official port of entry with Puerto Palomas, a small town of about 3,000 to 4,000 people on the Chihuahua, Mexico side. Situated some 80 miles west of El Paso-Juárez, this location is as active as any other for drug, weapon, and human smuggling across the border. Much like El Paso-Juárez, it was a strategic locale for Pancho Villa and opposing forces during the Mexican Revolution roughly 100 years ago, and it remains a hotspot for lawlessness on the border. These places have retained their importance over time as key geographic nodes in what has become a highly militarized and politicized border region. In 2008, the entire police force of Palomas abandoned their posts and resigned in unison, fleeing drug gang retribution, about in 2010. In 2011, the mayor of Columbus, its police chief, and a city councilman were arrested on gun smuggling charges in an operation that fed the drug cartels on the Palomas side. Campoy and Eaton, 2011. In a typical example of how crime networks tend to stretch across the entire region, the guns originated in Chaparral, New Mexico, 90 miles west of Columbus, between Las Cruces, New Mexico, and El Paso, Texas. This book is filled with many such examples of the crisscrossing clandestine links that exist in all directions in the area. From east to west, This 130-mile border region contains 5 official ports of entry: Fort Hancock, Tornillo, El Paso, Santa Teresa, and Columbus, Palomas. El Paso alone has 6 of Texas's 11 international land port bridges, each facilitating some combination of daily commercial, vehicular, and pedestrian traffic. This region is the most reinforced area of homeland security along the entire U.S.-Mexico border, Millman 2007, and sees a higher volume of trade than any border sector, Texas Comptroller 2017. Nonetheless, as an unnatural, man-made barrier, it will never be as effective at keeping the two countries as separate as it purports. The interconnectedness of the various locales in this region are as old as the settlements themselves, and it remains an implausible goal to keep their exchanges separate based on the international boundary. In the midst of the Trump administration's hardline anti-immigration policies as the backdrop, my purpose is to offer a historical view of this borderland region's criminal subcultures and adaptations to the political boundary on both sides of the law. The place furthest from the actual border with Mexico, but that is a vital part of this region's anatomy, is Las Cruces, New Mexico, about 50 miles northwest of El Paso, Juárez, on Interstate 10. This growing city, of just over 100,000 people, is connected to the heart of the region in terms of its culture, infrastructure, e.g., media outlets and public utilities, and social networks, both normative and criminal. It therefore is included in this study of historical dynamics and other features of the region in the context of its street gangs and related subcultures. The issues of Mexican immigration, border security, and related topics have been extensively covered in the media and explored by academics and other writers. Some even argue it has been overdone. Olson, Shirk, and Seeley, 2010. However, it has seldom, if ever, been analyzed with a socio-historical framework that is focused exclusively on its street-level criminological elements. That is the primary contribution of this book. Barrio gangs and the borderland. Barrio gangs date at least as far back as the 1920s in most Mexican-American Chicano communities in the United States. Bogardus, 1943, Vigil, 1988. As I have stated elsewhere, they are well studied in California, but not in many other places. Tapia, 2017. Notable exceptions include the literature for San Antonio, Montejano, 2010, Valdez, 2005, Valdez et al., 2009, Denver, Duran, 2013, Tucson, Cummings, 2003, and Washington State, Moreno, 2006, to name a few. El Paso, Texas, is regarded by academics and much of the lay public as the birthplace of the Zoot Suit Pachuco, the original Chicano youth street subculture. This title arguably belongs as much to Ciudad Juárez as it does to El Paso, an issue that is discussed in chapters 1 and 4, but it is interesting that there is not much published academic work on such topics for this locale. Several important exceptions include Coulthard, 1965, Duran, 2018, Garcia, 1995, and Gunder, 2018. Among these, none is solely focused on the history and evolution of barrio gangs in this binational metroplex or its broader region. The chronology I cover begins with the neighborhood-based societies of poor, streetwise El Paso youth in the 1920s and 1930s, moving through the decades to examine changes in each distinct era of this durable barrio gang subculture. Each chapter takes a different major population center in the region in turn, profiling local gang histories and their importance in the larger setting, including its modern criminal networks. I detail the primary gangs in each place and the network linkages that exist among them across this unique borderland region. I treat these topics with criminological frameworks, juxtaposing my findings with those of related works, and compare them to those involving Chicano gangs in other regions. This approach allows me to address questions of continuity and change in the timeline of barrio gangs across the Southwest more generally. Traditional barrio gang subculture has undergone more changes in the last 10 to 15 years than it has in the several decades prior, and the rather drastic changes suggest it may be headed for extinction. For example, these groups no longer seem to congregate on street corners and posture in public to claim turf against their proximate competitors, which is a break from decades of this cultural norm. Gunder 2017, Quiñones 2014. There are examples of this offered at each research site. A basic impetus for the work, then, is to help preserve some of the history of this once abundant feature of the Mexican-American experience, a fixture in U.S. Chicano and Mexican border communities for about the past 100 years. The migration of gang-involved individuals and families in the Southwest has been a strong feature shaping the gang norms of each locale in the study. In tracing the history of such gang elements, anthropological snippets of urban Chicano culture are elucidated along the way. Finally, the borderland is a salient socio-political topic, especially in terms of public safety, crime, drugs, and homeland security. The role of geography is particularly important in the unique formation, structure, and intensity of borderland gangs versus that found in the nation's non-border locales. Ironically, the actual threats to public safety posed by criminal organizations on the U.S. side of the borderland are minimal. Among large U.S. cities, El Paso in particular has had one of the lowest violent crime rates for decades, most recently ranked as the second safest, El Paso Herald-Post 2017. Its gang subcultures are therefore over-vilified, but they are not completely benign. I specify the conditions under which they pose or posed an actual threat to public safety, with a historical approach that comes to present day. Methods and influences. The information in this book comes from a wide variety of sources. It includes newspaper archives, police records, public and classified intelligence reports from local and federal agencies, insights and information from other published scholarly work, the archived records of the interventionists and community activists, and interviews of people knowledgeable about the book's various subtopics. The borderland region is interesting in that drugs, gangs, and clandestine underworld elements are endemic, camouflaged, but often in plain sight. Therefore, many rich sources of information abound, even in unlikely places. As Campbell 2009 notes, most every native or long-time resident of the region either remembers or knows firsthand of something or someone of relevance to the street gang drug nexus. This also applies to members of local law enforcement who grew up in the barrio and who became highly effective at their jobs due to their prior familiarity with its networks and methods of operation. Often their familiarity with these elements comes from within their own kin. I drew on oral histories of South El Paso residents contained in a special collection of the University of Texas at El Paso, UTEP Library, that are rich in detail about barrio life in bygone eras. I collected brief oral histories of my own from retired members of law enforcement and other border dwellers. I also drew on the published work of Father Harold Rahm and Robert Weber, 1958, who worked with gang youth in South El Paso in the early 1950s. The investigative writing of the late Charles Bowden 2002, while not academic in nature per se, documents decades of borderland drug scene dynamics in one case, spun around the family story of the region's former DEA chief. These and other intellectual ventures back and forth across the Juárez-El Paso border illustrated the macro-level relationships involving the U.S. and Mexican governments, down to the micro-level tactical maneuvers of sicarios working for the Juárez cartel. Malloy and Bowden, 2012. Academic works about the borderlands underworld have also demonstrated the mundaneness of its drug cultures. In Drug War Zone, Frontline Dispatches from the Streets of El Paso and Juárez, 2009, Howard Campbell, an anthropologist at UTEP, illustrates this. He offers a very broad view of drug smuggling history that includes case studies of street-level dealers on both sides of the border, of modern hybrid drug cultures in El Paso, embedded in normative networks and in typical teen behaviors. He also includes the perceptions of longtime county and federal law enforcement agents working on border drug interdiction. In his archival work, old Juárez drug dealers are depicted, and although these portions are very thin compared to my work, he was also able to interview insiders to the barrio gang scenes of the 1960s through the 1980s. Former New Mexico State University at Las Cruces sociologist Robert Duran's book, Gang Paradox, Inequality and Miracles on the U.S.-Mexico Border 2018, offers an alternative look at similar topics. As is Duran's style in other major works, it is a macro-sociological, historical take on the creation, existence, and meaning of gangs in El Paso and the broader region. Duran's thesis is that gangs are born from the forces of discrimination and the resultant subcultures that emerge in the lower working class. He writes about the moral panics created by the press and law enforcement that mislead the public about threats to public safety. Duran's work is framed by a strong social justice orientation that views the emergence of Pachuco border gangs as a type of resistance. Gunder, 2018-2019, is one of very few scholars, perhaps the only one so far, to address the history and evolution of the region's most notorious modern gang, the Barrio Azteca. He does so in the context of recent changes in prison gang structure and the implications of such changes on the order of the street, topics that I also address here and elsewhere. Tapia, Sparks, and Miller, 2014. Although these authors and I have all written about borderland crime dynamics using similar types of sources and frameworks, the results are substantially different, and each is insightful in its own way. I attempt to bring many of these elements together in this book. Chapter Previews. Chapter 1 offers a brief history of South El Paso neighborhoods and its gangs going back to the 1920s. I draw on archived interviews of South El Paso residents who spoke of this era's vibrant community life, its ethnic relations, and street subcultures. The published work and personal insights of the learned El Paso historian Fred Morales were extremely helpful in guiding this chapter. Newspaper archives and Father Ram's 1958 work also provided much insight to these issues. I build a timeline that moves through the decades, following trends and changes in the character of El Paso barrio gangs through the 1960s. This chronology sets up a foundation for the modern groups handled in later chapters, depicting the formation of the most menacing of current groups, such as the Sureño 13, the Chuco Tangos, and the Barrio Azteca. Taking the same approach for the nearby cities of Las Cruces and Anthony, New Mexico, Chapters 2 and 3 describe their gang histories and the network linkages that exist across the borderland region. Over the past several decades, El Paso, Anthony, and Las Cruces have seen gangs transplanted from California, Chicago, and Juárez, and the latter's westernmost impoverished colonias, shanty towns, such as Anapra. In Chapter 2, I profile some of the earliest known groups to emerge in Las Cruces, based on discussions with former gang members, retired law enforcement, and other community members who witnessed these developments. I then build a timeline that runs to current day, as street gang issues have remained salient in Las Cruces until quite recently. I offer a broad description of the gang dynamics that took shape there over time. Often it embodies archetypal Chicano gang elements that are found in other larger southwestern cities, and at times it shows characteristics that are unique to the small city context. Anthony is a small community, population 15,000, located halfway between El Paso County, population 840,000, and Las Cruces in Doña Ana County, New Mexico, population 215,000. As it sits right on the state boundary, half of Anthony is in Texas and half is in New Mexico. It is surrounded by a series of smaller communities that straddle the state line and that surprisingly have street gang histories of their own dating back to the 1960s. Chapter 3 profiles this community and others in its proximity with respect to their gang origins and networks to other places in the region. Chaparral, New Mexico, population 20,000, for example, sits across Interstate 10 from Anthony and is hidden 8 miles into a mountain range off the highway. Its gang networks stem from nearby northeast El Paso, Anthony, and Las Cruces. Sunland Park, New Mexico, is situated between El Paso, Texas, and Santa Teresa, New Mexico, bordering with Anapra, an impoverished colonia of western Juárez. Sunland Park, therefore, represents the convergence of a tri-state area and shares its gang networks with all of these locations. Prior to fortifying of the border in that area in the late 1970s, and prior to the establishment of the municipality of Sunland Park in 1983, it was known only as Anapra, and it was spread across both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. These communities in and around Anthony comprise the connective tissue among the 3 major urban centers in the region, El Paso, Las Cruces, and Juárez, and it is evidenced in their delinquent networks and subcultures. Chapter 4 focuses on Ciudad Juárez, describing its symbiotic relationship with El Paso and challenging the sister city trope that is commonly used by politicians, the business community, and culture scholars. It traces the history of these sin cities to the Prohibition era. It characterizes the types of banditry, delinquency, and gangsterism that predominated on both sides of the river as a shared underworld subculture. Gradual changes in gang structure and the radical spike of Juárez's violence level to record heights in 2010 are detailed in search of an explanation for this shift. The contemporary work of Mexican sociologists and journalists is reviewed and considered in this assessment of the record-setting drug gang violence in Juárez. Spillover effects into El Paso or other places in the United States, and more notably, the paradoxical lack thereof, are also discussed at length. Chapter 5 details the contemporary gang landscape in El Paso using police data as its starting point. A paradox is identified wherein police claim gang crime is at a record high in 2017, yet the city's violent crime rates continue to be among the lowest in the United States. The literature on Latino violence is reviewed in search of an explanation for this contradiction. El Paso's modern gang issues, 1980s to current time, its hotspots, its notorious gangs, and both inter- and intra-ethnic group conflicts involving its black gangs are detailed. The chapter ends with a profile of the evolution of the most intense and sophisticated street prison hybrid gang to ever emerge in El Paso, its historical ties to drug gangs in Juárez, and its more recent formal mergers are described as the catalysts in its creation. Competition from other allied forces on both sides of the international border are also detailed. The final chapter sums up the lessons learned from examining the criminological dynamics of this unique border region over time. It begins by resisting the glorification of gang life in the face of the social ills that produce it and that result from it, the role of geography in producing unique gang subcultures, the meaning of place, and the bifurcation of the region by the border are also expounded. Relatedly, the paradox of the abundant gang presence and subculture, accompanied by low violence rates in El Paso and the contrast of Juárez's profuse violence, adds to the region's complexity. The network features of gangs across the borderland region and its intricacies are further considered. Recent shifts in Chicano gang structures and the nuances of gang developments in this region vis-a-vis neighboring regions to the east and the west are also laid out. The book closes with several observations about the most recent changes occurring among gang millennials. 1. The early barrio gangs of El Paso, Texas, 1920s to 1960s. Introduction. Perhaps because it is the largest and oldest adjacent border city to Mexico, El Paso's barrio gang history goes back further than that of any other U.S. city. A careful analysis of this place and its early delinquent street gangs is therefore a critical starting point. El Paso is well known by scholars of various disciplines, e.g., literature, history, ethnic studies, sociology, to be the birthplace of the Zoot Suit Pachuco, e.g., Coulthard, 1965, Garcia, 1995, Ornstein, 1983. Safety. Most would say this is an ancestor to the lowrider Cholo, and that both are predecessors of the modern-day Chicano gang member. Others might argue that each subculture is distinct, and not all of them are necessarily criminogenic. Nonetheless, the overlap among them is undeniable. The epicenter of such urban subcultures and their street activities for roughly the past century has been south-central El Paso, with particular roots in the two barrios still known today as Chihuahuita and Segundo Barrio. Part of this chapter depicts gang turf in these areas in the 1950s and 1960s, the heyday of barrio gangs. This chapter begins with a brief history of these neighborhoods and its gangs going back to the 1920s and 1930s. I draw on oral histories of South El Paso residents from this era, on the work of Father Harold Rahm, 1958, who worked with gang youth in South El Paso in the early 1950s, and on the work of self-taught El Paso historian Fred Morales, who grew up in Chihuahuita. His books and photos illuminate the earliest groups of delinquent youth in South El Paso, going back to about 1910. Newspaper archives from this era also provide much insight to these issues. This chapter's timeline follows trends and changes in the character of El Paso barrio gangs from about 1915 through the 1960s. El Chuco, Juaritos as the epicenter. Most major cities in the southwestern United States have become well-known sites.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?